When we picture the Late Bronze Age, we tend to see the great empires: Egypt, the Hittites, Babylon. But just as important were the smaller kingdoms trying to survive in their shadow, and sometimes there are even smaller kingdoms surviving in their shadows. Often overlooked and seldom understood, Siyannu and Ushnatu were two such cities on the Syrian coast. What can their story tell us about the politics and pressures faced by small kingdoms in a world ruled by giants? And how did they manage to outlast their overlords? Let's dig in. Siyannu and Ushnatu are two cities that are known from texts found at Ugarit. The evidence we have for these cities is sporadic and seen largely through the lens of Ugarit. But there's a fair bit we can say about these entities as long as we make a few sizable caveats. First, to really understand these cities, you have to get into the nitty-gritty of historical geography. One aspect of historical geography, and the one that we want to address now, is site identification. Specifically, identifying which modern ruins correlate to which ancient sites. Some sites are easy. Places like Jericho and Damascus have been near continuously occupied since prehistoric times. Aleppo is the same, even if it wasn't always called Aleppo but Halab during the Bronze Age. Other sites can be correlated with ancient ones because of excavation. Ras Shamra and Tel Atkana both have caches of tablets which identify the sites as being the ancient cities of Ugarit and Alalak. The Bronze and Iron Age city of Gezer is identified by actual labeled boundary markers showing the extent of the city in the Hellenistic period. Other sites, though, are known from archaeology, but we don't know for sure what the name of the ancient city was. For some larger cities, this is relatively easy, but for most modern ruins, it's really not easy to know what the location was called in ancient times. In the Near East, toponymy is often used. There's a remarkable continuity in place names that, in many cases, is preserved in Arab village names. Gezer, the site with the boundary stones, is known by the Arabic name Tel Jazar. Siyannu is another great example. The ancient name of Siyannu is in Ugaritic texts. There's also a ruin in modern Syria known as Tel Siyannu, just spelled different. Less than 10 kilometers away is the site of Tel Tuwaini in modern Jabla, a site historical geographers agree is ancient Gabala, a site similarly known in the Ugaritic corpus. And this is the case for several sites. Modern Arwad is linked with ancient Arwad. Modern Tel Sukas is associated with ancient Shuksi. So in many cases, the towns and villages in the Ugaritic text can be linked with modern ruins based on the continuity of names. But this isn't always the case, as made clear by Ushnatu. By my tally, Ushnatu has been identified with no less than 3 different ancient ruins, with each one having pros and cons for it. Different linguists, archaeologists, and historical geographers have suggested Ushnatu be located at Tel Arab al-Muk, a site at the mouth of the Nahr el-Sen River. Others have suggested it is a couple kilometers inland at the site of Tel Daruk. Still others have placed it further south at Tel Hussein, also called Tel Butsira. There seems to be a consensus forming around Tel Daruk, as soundings in the 1950s showed occupation from the Chalcolithic through the medieval period. Arguments for and against these sites usually come back to its proximity to the more securely identified Siyannu. This is because Siyannu and Ushnatu were technically 2 distinct kingdoms in the Bronze Age, but were united under one monarch in a kind of dual kingdom. So arguments for the sites on the Nahr el-Sin have been argued that it's too close to Siyannu for the two to have developed into distinct kingdoms, so the more distant position is favored. Others have argued Tel Daruk is not large enough to be the capital of its own kingdom. Tel Siyannu, on the other hand, is one of the 5 largest ancient ruins between Tripoli and Latakia, suggesting it was a site of some importance. Others don't see Tel Daruk as an issue because while the 2 kingdoms did develop as independent kingdoms, they were close enough to become dual kingdoms by the Late Bronze Age. For the sake of this video, we will identify Ushnatu with Tel Daruk, as that is where most scholars currently place it. However, this is done with a heavy dose of caution, as future excavations may easily disprove this equivalence. So even if the exact location of Ushnatu remains uncertain, what's clear is that both cities stood close enough to influence and occasionally irritate their more powerful neighbors. Text from Ugarit suggests Siyannu and Ushnatu weren't just neighbors but partners, a dual kingdom ruled by a single king. This dual nature is a curious arrangement, but not the only one like it in the ancient Near East. Now, first off, how do we know it was a dual kingdom? Well, in at least one text, which we'll look at in more depth shortly, Ugarit and Siyannu are being delineated. Ugarit and its lists of towns is given, then the text reads, Siyannu together with its neighboring cities, and Ushnatu together with its neighboring cities, with their territories, with their mountains. So both Siyannu and Ushnatu are set in apposition to Ugarit. We also see a man named Ari-Teshub, who is called variously King of Siyannu as well as King of Ushnatu. The simplest reading of the relevant text is that this Ari-Teshub is the same man, who is king of both Siyannu and of Ushnatu. Now there are ways of getting around this, but not without some gymnastics, and that this figure was a king of a dual kingdom is accepted as the best interpretation. We don't know how Siyannu and Ushnatu became a dual kingdom. Ushnatu has obviously not been excavated in any systemic way, and Siyannu has been excavated but not fully published. The site has substantial Iron Age remains, something we'll return to in a moment, that do obscure the late Bronze Age strata. There are Middle Bronze Age remains and even earlier. The city apparently was founded as part of the Second Urban Revolution in Syria. So the city has a long history. We don't know how it came to be united with Ushnatu, and we don't know for how long the union lasted. But while Siyannu and Ushnatu was a dual kingdom, it was still a minor one. When these cities enter the textual record, they are already united and they are already a vassal or client kingdom of Ugarit. Mershili II notes, from time immemorial the king of Ugarit and the king of Siyannu has been a unity. So the kingdoms of Siyannu and Ushnatu were apparently already subject to the king of Ugarit by the time Ugarit became a vassal of the Hittites. And we know the king of Ugarit was a vassal of the Hittites by 1350. So in the mid-14th century, there was a king of Siyannu and Ushnatu which owed Ugarit a yearly tribute, who himself owed the Hittites a yearly tribute. Following the Hittite subjugation of Syria by Shupillium I, he made his son the king of Carchemish, who ruled the region as a viceregal king over Syria, which further complicated the legal relationships in the region. Most of the minor kingdoms in Syria were subject to the Hittites, mediated by Carchemish. But Siyannu and Ushnatu were vassals of Ugarit, who was a direct vassal of the Hittite king. But this legal standing didn't preclude Ugarit and its vassals from interacting with the king of Carchemish and the other minor kingdoms, especially when they needed to address legal issues, like border and economic disputes between the many Syrian polities. Within this layered system of loyalties, boundaries mattered, and they often changed. Now, as a bit of background, in the mid-14th century, Ugarit signed a treaty making it a vassal of the Hittites. A few years after this, the Ugaritic king Niqmadu II apparently failed to fulfill all of his vassal duties to the Hittite king and lost the confidence of the Hittites. The short tenure of the Ugaritic king Aralhaba resulted in the succession of Nekhmepa around 1312. Shortly thereafter, he signed a new vassal treaty with the Hittite king Mershili II. In this text, we find that Ugarit's situation with Siyannu had changed. In this new treaty, we find that the king of Siyannu, a man named Abdi Anati, wanted to transfer his vassal status from Ugarit to Carchemish. Mershili reviewed the plea and granted the transfer of vassalage of Siyannu to Carchemish. What followed was a demarcation of a boundary between the two, now separate, entities. This was done by listing the towns which belonged to Ugarit and then listing the towns that belonged to Siyannu. The list is now unfortunately fragmentary, but there are a few recoverable names. But even if we had the full list, we may not be in too much of an improved position. This is because of the named towns, only a few can be positively identified on a map. Starting with Ugarit, there are several towns which can be read, interspersed with several lines that are broken beyond any sure reading. The first is Arua. This may be a Hurrianized form of the town Aru, known from other Ugaritic texts, but Arua might also be the name of a district of the Kingdom of Ugarit, the district of Arua, which was on the south or southeast of the kingdom. Aru is a well-known site in the Ugaritic texts and is among the most important sites in the southern half of the kingdom, with a significant cultic shrine. And this was followed by Dumatu Agimi, Atalig, Gebala, possibly Bet Gimad, and Dumatu Kidshi. The towns belonging to Siyannu are too fragmentary to get much of anything clearly, only a couple places: Shamne, Yulre, and Ushnatu. Of the Ugaritic sites, only Gabala can be truly positively identified with a known ruin. The rest have suggestions. Based on a study by Wilfred van Soldt, we can surmise the towns in Ugarit tend to be clustered in lists based on geography. These lists tend to even be somewhat standardized to show a directional flow. The most common names grouped together from the southern portion of Ugarit, perhaps called the Arua district, the wealthier and more densely populated region, are Apu, Pidu, Gubelu, Muluku, Aru, Atalig, and Gibala. Van Soldt argues this moves from the north or northwest to the south or southwest, from modern Latakia down to modern Jebla. If that's the case, and using some modern toponyms and geographic clues in other texts, then these sites may be placed something like this. Apu means nose, so it's typically placed close to a promontory. Pidu is associated with modern Fidio, but the ancient site may be closer to the coastline. Atalig is said to have a harbor, so it's likely closer to Gabala, which is known to be at Tel Tueni. Aru is north of Atalig and also has a harbor. Muluku is believed to derive from the root for king and may have started as a royal estate. It's likely not to be associated with Tel Muluk, despite the toponymic similarity. Other sites in the list cannot be confidently identified. Dumatu Kidshi, for example, is problematic because Dumatu is a prefix on a few locations, which may refer to either a tower, which is less likely, or to a stop or station. It's not clear if this was an entirely permanent fixture and may be more like a landmark. And we don't have a definitive list for the towns of Siyannu-Ushnatu. One text has been cited to include a list of towns in Siyannu. These would include Lashabe, Sile, Dumatu Kidshi, Mershe, Galili Turkiya, Ure, Kimtsi, Sa'a, Mardusha, Armeli, and Marail. Michael Astour believes this text lists towns in Siyannu, as the text says, people from Karatu who live in various towns in the land of Siyannu. But it's possible to interpret the text not as a list of towns in Siyannu, but that the lists of towns are all in Ugarit, and then this final line refers to people in Siyannu, and thus beyond the concern of the Ugaritic bureaucracy. If Astour is to be followed here, the sites in Siyannu-Ushnatu would be something like this. He uses modern toponyms and geographical clues in the text to identify these site locations. However, Van Soldt argues that many of these towns are all elsewhere noted as being within Ugarit. Marail, for example, is a well-known location in the northwest of Ugarit. But these are all relatively small villages, and it's possible, if not probable, that names would be repeated between regions. So this may be the extent of Siyannu-Ushnatu if Astour's reading is accurate. If not, then the best we can say is from Mershili's treaty, which states Siyannu together with its neighboring cities, and Ushnatu with its neighboring cities, with their territories, with their mountains. The mountains here is almost certainly the ridge of the Syrian coastal mountain range. We surmise the southern boundary of Siyannu-Ushnatu was with Amuru, but that northern boundary of Amuru is not particularly clear. In the treaty between Nikmadu of Ugarit and Aziru of Amuru, Siyannu makes an appearance, though importantly not as a party to the treaty. The king of Siyannu, Abdi-Hepa, is referenced because his kingdom is on the southern border of Ugarit and borders Amuru. It is likely Ushnatu bordered the hinterland of Arwad, which may have been either nominally independent or subject to Amuru. If we reject Astour's reading, which may be the wiser option, we don't have many localities on the south of Siyannu-Ushnatu with which to reconstruct the territoriality of the dual kingdom. As one scholar put it, the relations between Siyannu and Ugarit caused much clay to be needed in the 14th and 13th centuries BC, because boundaries described on clay tablets didn't always match the reality on the ground. In the various subsequent texts, we get even more clarity on the border between Siyannu and Ugarit because that was a particularly contentious patch of land. There are several texts which describe border disputes and what has been termed economic warfare. These disputes were frequent. They are one of the more consistent topics in the entire corpus of Ugaritic texts. Things actually got so dire the king of Carchemish had to send a delegation to set up boundary stones to delineate where the boundary was once and for all. But until that was settled, there were frequent disputes over fields and natural resources. For example, in the original treaty, Mursili II established salt fields which were divided between the two kingdoms, 2/3 to Ugarit in the area around Attalig, and 1/3 to Siyannu. But it wasn't just salt. Vineyards were contested. In a tablet sealed by a king of Siyannu named Padilla, the vineyards for Ishtar Khuri are divided between the Marziyu of Ugarit and those of Siyannu. The Marziyu was a kind of popular religious association, a group of men who conducted various religious or perhaps magical rituals, and used the resources of this field for their occultic rites. The groups from Siyannu and those from Ugarit may have been affiliated with the same local cultic shrine dedicated to Ishtar at Shuksi, but because they were in different kingdoms, they sought to split the field and its product between them. This field was ostensibly owned by the temple, but was apparently on the border between Ugarit and Siyannu, where specifically can't be certain. Some scholars argue that the division of Siyannu and Ugarit was not a nice, clean border, but included enclaves and exclaves of towns, villages, and even fields that belonged to one kingdom that were fully enveloped in the other. If this is the case, largely depends on specific interpretations of texts and where one identifies certain localities. Further complicating things is that in this particular case, the temple had some renown, so it may have owned land farther afield than the immediate environs of Shuksi. So the vineyard may have been owned by the temple in Shuksi, but it's possible it was closer to Ari, where the Ugaritic Marziyu under discussion were located. And land may not always have been contiguous with the town or city that asserted ownership. Another treaty again dealt with the territory of Shuksi. In it, the kings of Ugarit and Siyannu are assigned different territory around this city and the city of Harmanu based on who had owned them longer. Shuksi is known and associated with Taustukas, while Harmanu is not known. Similarly, the land around Muluku was given to the people of Muluku, and the land around Galba to the people of Galba. Possession really is 9/10 of the law. The lands around Shuksi were again further restricted by treaty under the reign of Tutali IV, when fields around the city and more salines, or salt fields, near Attalig were given to Ugarit. Other disputes include the king of Ushnatu disputing territory with Arania, a town in the southeast of the kingdom of Ugarit. This town, along with a few others, was apparently in frequent border disputes with Siyannu and Ushnatu. The nature of these disputes were not only claiming territory, at least not directly. Occasionally they were in the form of vandalism or harvesting crops that didn't belong to them. A king of Ushnatu, named Shabilim, wrote the king of Ugarit protesting that Ugarishan farmers were escorted by soldiers and came into his territory and sowed seeds in fields claimed by Ushnatu. Shabilim threatens that if the men aren't removed, then he will come in and harvest what was sown. Other texts seek redress for cattle stolen across the borders, threatening even to go to the king of Carchemish for redress if the Ugaritic king doesn't make it right. The king of Carchemish had to write to the people of Siyannu and tell them they would receive punishments if they destroyed watchtowers, pruned vineyards belonging to Ugarit, or sold stolen wine to Ugarit's economic rival in Beirut. These are specific crimes that the king of Carchemish cites and threatens punishment for, which strongly suggests these were crimes that had already been committed by people from Siyannu. Also, the frequent issue of vineyards has led some interpreters to call this a wine war, which is discussed in even more texts. The greatest threat, though, was not purely agricultural, but the trafficking of human capital. That is, selling people from across the border into slavery. Two specific texts deal with the sale of a merchant, Ba'aliya, probably an Ugarishan, by his own business partner. The king of Carchemish had to get involved and resolve the issue between the kingdoms. One interesting dispute was not between men from Siyannu and Ugarit, but a man from Imar and Siyannu. And this apparently took place before Siyannu was separated from Ugarit by Mursili. Reconstructing the sequence of events using only part of the correspondence using fragmentary text is difficult, but it seems that a man from Imar had a dispute with a man from Siyannu. Imar was a vassal of Carchemish, so the man from Imar ran it up the chain to the king of Carchemish as he wanted redress from a man from a foreign kingdom. The king of Carchemish wrote to the king of Ugarit as Siyannu was a vassal of Ugarit at the time. The king of Ugarit wrote to the king of Siyannu, and the king of Siyannu investigated and found that the man in question was actually a resident of Aru, a city which was subject to Ugarit, not Siyannu. So the king of Siyannu reported back that it was not his jurisdiction, and so the king of Ugarit would have to deal with the king of Carchemish to resolve the issue. And this is a particularly interesting case as it shows how legal jurisdictions worked in the ancient world when multiple vassal relationships were also at play. One final possible conflict between Siyannu and Ugarit is dated to the reign of Tutulia IV. The name of the Ugaritic king is missing, as is the name of the addressee, but given the subject of the text, interpreters often date it to the years just before 1200 BC. The text refers to a military threat facing Ugarit, and so militia were being called up to protect the Ugaritic frontier, specifically the town of Aru and another settlement that only has a single sign preserved, but it may be Maluku. The towns are endangered by a leader named Ariteshub and his Apiru troops. Now, Apiru may just be a derogatory term, or it may refer to an actual social class of people. It's not clear how it's being used here. The name Ariteshub is a common enough Hurrian name in the Ugaritic archives, but it's also the name of a known king of Siyannu who was a contemporary of Tutulia IV. Given the towns that threat border Siyannu, it's possible this may be an actual military action taken by Siyannu against Ugarit, and possible at a time of weakness. Ugarit's military was apparently not at the disposal of the king. Perhaps he was serving the king of the Hittites elsewhere in the empire, and thus the militia was called up to defend against the border incursion. While Ugarit vanished in the fires of the 12th century, Siyannu and Ushnatu lingered in the background of history, their names still appearing centuries later in Assyrian texts. In the Kirk monoliths where Shalmaneser III records his conflict with the coalition of Syro-Levantine kingdoms, we see Siyannu and Ushnatu, now recorded in Assyrian Akkadian as Usnu and Siyannu. No king is named for Usnu, while Adunu Baal is named as king of Siyannu. It's possible Adunu Baal was king of Siyannu and Usnu and the dual kingdom was preserved, but it's not possible to say given the text as it stands. They appear again a century later in the annals of Tiglath-Pileser III, where they appear as cities within the kingdom of Hamat. They appear together with Samira, Bronze Age Sumer, Arka, and then Usnu and Siyannu, as places that were subject to population exchange. Archaeologically, Usnu is still obviously unknown, but tells Siyannu has sizable Iron III structures, indicating the city continued to thrive well into the Iron Age. The sizable late Iron Age structures in fact obscure the late Bronze Age strata, and may have damaged whatever late Bronze Age remains existed. The site transitioned peaceably into the Hellenistic period, where it was an important Seleucid site. It was eventually eclipsed by Laodicea and Gabala, whereafter it became more agriculturally oriented and more rural. Siyannu and Ushnatu may not have ended in glory. There was no great last stand, no destruction layer marking their fall, no epic inscribed in clay forever immortalized in the fires of their own destruction. They simply faded, absorbed into the kingdoms that followed. Yet, their story matters. They outlasted Ugarit, Carchemish, and the other giants of the Bronze Age world. And for a time, they kept their communities alive, their vineyards tended, and their names remembered long after their overlords vanished. They remind us that survival itself can be a kind of triumph. In a world that collapsed around them, Siyannu and Ushnatu lasted, and that, more than anything, is worth remembering.